It's also a testament to having a feeling and following it, not knowing what the outcome is going to be or what to expect.
But you couldn't deny it.
I couldn't deny it, no.
Welcome to Desert Lady Diaries podcast, conversations with women who have found their home in the Mojave Desert. I'm Susan Henry, and this is episode 165. Find out more about the podcast at desertladydiaries.com. Engage with the guests and the other listeners on Facebook and Instagram at Desert Lady Diaries. Born and raised in New Jersey, Dawn Davis was drawn to the desert after lengthy careers in banking, project management, and media. After 14 years in the corporate scene, she spent more than 20 years as an actor, voiceover, and producer. Dawn is an award-winning actor, and for the last 4 years has hosted and produced the Desert Lady Diaries podcast. This month, she will celebrate 2 years as the owner of Soul Connection, a gift shop in Joshua Tree. Welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you. And this is interesting because we're turning the tables a little bit this week. Just as way of explanation, I'm being interviewed today by Susan Henry, who was, I don't remember your episode number, but you were interviewed within the last 2 months for the podcast. And Susan is the owner and operator of Zandalions in downtown Joshua Tree, and she is my landlord for Soul Connection. And I was telling her that Pat Remington, who was episode 41, had suggested to me at some point during this podcasting journey that someone interview me, because eventually when someone goes and listens to these episodes in the 29 Palms Historical Society archive, they're going to wonder, who is this person who interviewed all of these people? With that in mind, Susan volunteered to be the interviewer, and I today am the interviewee.
So, Dawn, what was your first experience with the desert?
My first experience with the desert was in Scottsdale, Arizona. I was still living in New Jersey at the time. Avid fan of the New York Giants, and a guy that I was dating at the time was also a New York Giants fan, and would get this newspaper every week dedicated to everything New York Giants. And we noticed that there was an ad in the paper for a travel company who would arrange for fans to go to away games where the Giants were playing. So we decided that we would go to the Arizona Cardinals game, which was out in the Phoenix area. And I remember flying over the desert and then flying into Phoenix and getting off the plane and looking at the mountains and being like, those look like billboards. Are those real? Because I had never, that was my first time west of the Mississippi. And I had never seen the mountains like they were. But I had always had some kind of kinship, is probably not the right word, but the desert always appealed to me, even when I lived on the East Coast. Everywhere I've ever lived, I've decorated the inside of my home with cactus, adobe, Native American prints, and things like that. So it's really interesting that I would end up here eventually. But that was my first experience. And I experienced the Grand Canyon on that trip because I thought, well, I don't know when I'll be out this way again, so let's take a Grand Canyon trip. And that was kind of crazy. It was a van trip. There were probably, I don't know, about 8 or 10 of us in the van. None of us knew each other. Well, there were people that were there that weren't on the same trip that we were, but we were all hired this tour company to take us up to the Grand Canyon. And I don't know if you're listening, you may be familiar with Oak Creek Canyon. I think it's Oak Creek Canyon. It's just north of Phoenix. So it's high enough that it gets snow, and we were there in early December. So you're down in Scottsdale, and you're sitting by the pool sipping drinks, and it's, I don't know, 80 degrees. And then you get in this van, and you travel north, and then all of a sudden it's snowing. We had a head-on collision with the van. Nobody was hurt. Everybody was going slow enough through this snowy pass not to get too damaged, but we got a little sidetracked. And the driver, the owner of the tour company, for the rest of the trip, he made sure there was a piece of paper over the speedometer so nobody could see how fast he was going, because I guess he was trying to make up time. But it was an excellent trip. We had initially thought about doing the train that goes, I think, from Williams into the canyon. But what I didn't realize is that we would have seen very little of the Grand Canyon. But by doing this tour with this guy, he not only took us to a number of different places within Grand Canyon, but outside of the park as well. And then he had it planned out where we would pull into this one reservation. And he gave us the whole layout. He said, you will sit down, you will order your lunch, then you will go in the gift shop and do your shopping. I will come and get you when your lunch is served. You'll eat your lunch, go back in the gift shop and finish your purchases, and then we'll carry on.
Wow.
Yeah, he was really like on
Efficient.
it. Totally. And so we did that, and then we went to all those spots around the canyon. And then on the way home, we stopped. He tried a new restaurant in, I think it was Prescott, where we stopped. And halfway between Prescott and getting back to Scottsdale, and by now the 10 of us have been through this head-on collision, this whole thing, so we're all friends now, He pulls the van off on the side of the road. It's pitch black, and says, okay, now I want y'all to get out of the van. And we all were silent. And then somebody finally cracked a joke and said, oh, you're going to rob us now that we've spent all our money on food and souvenirs? So we all got out of the van, and he said, okay, I now just want you all to look up.
How cool.
And it was amazing. The stars and all this, it was just unreal. So that was part of my first experience with the desert, was this crazy van trip.
Oh, wow, that's wonderful.
To the Grand Canyon.
Yeah. So what brought you to the high desert, Joshua Tree?
Well, friends of mine in downtown LA were getting married, but they were getting married at a ranch in San Bernardino. So a couple of us thought, hey, maybe it would be fun to take a long weekend, make a trip of it, and then hit the wedding on the way back. So it turned out only 3 of us could actually make this happen. So Carrie and Zach, who is no longer with us, we lost him about this time last year. Unfortunately, he drowned in the Pacific Ocean, and that's pretty devastating because he was just amazing, an amazing person. So we packed up and he drove. We stopped in Loma Linda. Well, I guess what I didn't say is we decided to come to Joshua Tree. We had thought about Death Valley, but then we thought, well, that's kind of far. Joshua Tree seemed more reasonable, and neither Carrie or I had been here, but Zach said he had been here before, which we later found out was just a trip where he and a friend had met some girls that were coming out to Joshua Tree. He and his friend drove out that night, and I don't know if they ever found them or not, and then they drove home the next day. So it wasn't really like he had a lot of experience with Joshua Tree. This was in April of 2016. So we drive out, and he's like, well, there's no place out there to get groceries, so we need to stop in Loma Linda and get groceries. So we don't know any better. So we go to Clark's and we get groceries and lunch for the next day for hiking and all that stuff. And then we get off the 10 and onto 62. We come through Morongo Valley, and I'm like, ooh, this is really interesting. I've never seen this place before. But it was at the top of the Yucca grade that things really started happening for me. I had a visceral response. We got to the top of that hill. I was in the front passenger seat, and I could feel, it was as though there was a string on the top of my head pulling me up, and I was sitting up straighter and straighter in my seat and just taking in everything around me, the trees, the terrain, just everything. I was completely fascinated with it. That's the only way I can explain it. All weekend, everywhere we went, whether we were eating in Crossroads or we ended up camping out at the Joshua Tree Lake. It was windy as hell all night long. Zach ended up going to sleep in the car because he just couldn't take the wind. It was, So the next morning we got up and we went into the park, and just this constant feeling of I was on observation. I was just everything, input.
Wow.
Yeah, it was kind of crazy. So...
And you didn't feel that at the other experience?
I didn't. I mean, I thought Scottsdale and the canyon and all that stuff was really cool, but I didn't have this sort of response.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, not at all. So the weekend goes by, we go to the wedding. which kind of is funny. Our hotel room wasn't ready, but we were, of course, dirty from camping and all this other stuff. And then our friend Michael was sending us all these. He's like, well, you could go and sign up for this gym membership and they'll let you in to shower for free or whatever. I'm like, oh my God, we're not doing that. We'll just wait. If we miss the ceremony, we miss it. I mean, we're not doing that. He was trying to be helpful. I appreciate that. So when I got home, I started just doing all kinds of research about Joshua Tree. And I found everything from a website that Jay and Stephanie up on the Copper Mountain Mesa had put together about their experience of moving and living in the desert. I came across YouTube videos of MAC meetings. And people are probably thinking, oh my God, you watch that stuff? But I'm telling you, these are some of the best ways to really find out what's going on in a community, what the community is about, what the culture is like in a community. So I really started to think like, I think I want to move to Joshua Tree. I want to move to the desert. I want to be in that place. And the other thing that meant so much to me when I was here was the silence.
Yeah.
The quiet was like nothing I had ever experienced. And I just felt like I had to be here. It was that kind of feeling. So 3 months later, I moved. Prior to that, I had done 2 or 3 trips, just like day trips or overnight trips. One of those trips was pretty significant. When things start going your way, I like to call it the green light syndrome. Mm-hmm. Like green light, green light, green light, nothing's impeding your way to doing this. So I had signed up for this workshop. It was like the beginning of July. I booked a Airbnb, a traditional Airbnb, like I was actually renting a room in someone's house. Because I thought, well, if you're going to move there, you need to be talking to somebody about what's going on out here. So I get there, the guy's asleep on the couch inside. So then I go to my room and put my things in. I come out on the front porch and sit in the Adirondack chair. He comes out and joins me, and I just burst into tears. And he was like, are you okay? And I'm like, yeah, this is one of the reasons that I'm planning on moving here. And we just stopped talking about, because he could tell I meant the silence. Before I left for that trip, though, I had contacted, at that time we had a brick and mortar Chamber of Commerce. So I called the Chamber of Commerce and I said, hey, listen, do people go away in the summer in Joshua Tree, or do they stay? Did they look for house sitters? He's like, oh no, people go away and, maybe hang a poster up at Frontier or at the health food store. And I was like, okay. So I made my little house sitting poster. And I said to my friend Carrie before I left town, I was like, I can't explain why, but I just feel like this guy that I'm staying in the Airbnb with is going to ask me to house sit. And she's like, well, I guess you'll find out when you get there. So I showed up on Saturday afternoon, I go to my workshop. Sunday, I'm sitting outside. I think I was coloring or something because I wasn't leaving until Monday. And Tom comes out and he says, so I'm going camping in Denver next week. I'm like, really? That's cool. And he said, well, it would be, except I forgot to black out the dates for the Airbnb and I have 2 bookings. And I was like, oh my gosh, what are you going to do? I mean, it flew right over my head, right? He's like, well, you were talking about house sitting. Do you think you'd... And I was like, is this really happening right now? And again, for me, that was like green light. Like, here it comes again. This is meant to be. He took me through the whole process of getting everything ready for the next guests that were coming in. And I was packing my car, and he comes out on the porch with this rifle in his hands. I'm like, okay, what's going on now? And he says, well, I'm just going to leave this by the door in case you have to show force for any reason. And I was like, where am I right now? He's like, and he said, in my room, because that's where I was going to be staying while the guests were in the other rooms, he said, I'm going to leave you a BB pistol under the pillow. And I was like, wait a minute, what is happening? He goes, well, sometimes you never know what can happen, and I want you to be prepared. And I was like, oh my God. But at night, when I was there, you would hear these like off-road vehicles come through. So you hear the noise like, and then all of a sudden, nothing. It's like, okay, why did you stop? What are you doing? What's going on? So when he brought these guns out, I'm like, oh, okay, well, I guess I'm just going to deal with this. And the house had no swamp cooler, no AC. It's July.
Oh, okay.
Just fans.
Wow.
So there were a couple of nights when I was there in the house by myself. There were no guests. And I didn't even run the fans because I was like on alert, just in case I needed to show force. So I figured July, if I can survive being out here during this time, I can probably live here.
That's a good test for sure.
Right? So I went back to LA. I hadn't even brought my laptop or anything with me, and I knew I would have work to do the following week, and he had closets that I could do voiceover work in. There was no Wi-Fi, so for the first 3 days it was charming to drive down to the library, download, check my email, get any scripts I needed, and then back to the house to record and edit, then back to the library to upload the files and all that stuff. Mm-hmm. But I mean, overall, I guess probably about the third or fourth day, I thought, well, maybe it's time to start looking for a place. So I looked around at a couple of places. I went to see a couple houses for rent. I went into this apartment complex where I live now, and I left town with the application. I scanned and emailed it back when I got back on Monday or Tuesday, and the property manager called me the next day and said, when do you want to come and sign your lease?
Wow.
So from April to, I think it was July 29th, I actually signed my lease. I paid rent there for a month, and I paid rent again for the final month in LA. I took 3 weeks to come out on weekends, so I'd pack my car on Thursday, come out on Friday, put stuff away in my cabinets, put in my shelf liner, all that stuff, and get ready. And then I would just explore for the rest of the weekend. And then Sunday evening would come around, or Sunday afternoon, and I was like, well, guess you got to get in the car and go back. And there were days when I didn't want to do it, but I knew at the end of the day I would be here in less than a month. So just sucked it up and got in the car and went back. And
because you had obligations in LA?
Well, I had obligations in LA with work, and then I didn't have all my stuff packed. So at that point, it was like the final weekend of August. My friends George and Zach helped me move out here with the bigger stuff in the U-Haul, and the rest is history.
So you didn't really have any plans of what you were going to do for a career out here?
I didn't, because I had the voiceover work, and I can technically do that anywhere. When I walked into this apartment, the first thing I saw was the walk-in closet, and I made a beeline for the closet, and the property manager's just like, oh, that's just a closet. I go, oh, you just don't understand. So when
That's my studio.
Exactly, and it still is. But, the desert will slap you around a little bit when you get out here, as it does. And I lost a huge client. That was a big reason why I moved out here. I'm like, well, I've got this huge client. The season, is coming up for the work that I did for them. I did work for them through the year, but there was a particular season when people do benefits enrollment. I would do benefits videos, telling people about their flexible spending accounts and about, if they switched providers and what they would need to do to sign up for benefits, etc. And suddenly, October 1st, I get an email that they're not renewing my contract. And that was after about a year of being here. And then it was time to cobble it together, I guess, as we say out here, and figure out how I was going to make some money. So I started doing some admin work. I was running out to the Palms a couple Sundays a month and working brunch because, when you have that waitress experience, you can pretty much work anywhere, except when you get a little older, then it gets a little rough.
But it's quick money.
It is quick money. Yes, it is.
Yeah, I think that must have been around when I first met you. You came into my shop, I think. You were bringing around brochures or something. Yes.
Actually, my friend Carrie, who had been out here on the first visit with me, she somehow found this posting online that this company, and I'm struggling to remember the name of it. They're out of Maine, Portland, Maine. But what they do is they created an app for phones that you could download, and it would have all of the maps or the attractions within the national park. So if you were in the national park and you couldn't get cell service, but you had downloaded the information from the app to your phone, you'd still have access to all the information. And I don't know that the app for Joshua Tree specifically was ready yet, but they had it for other national parks. So they wanted someone who was familiar with the local area that would go to like businesses, hotels, restaurants, and place these business cards, essentially is what they were, about the app to let people know that it was coming up and it would be available and all this other stuff. So yeah, I would travel from the from Morongo Valley at least twice a month. I'd go to from Morongo Valley out to 29 Palms and just stop in all these businesses. Initially it was, can we place this here? The app is free. It's not going to cost you anything, just some space on your counter or whatever. Mm-hmm. And then I would go subsequent weeks just to do refills or, answer any questions that anybody had about it. But yeah, that was one of those jobs.
Well, it's if you're a go-getter, it proves that you can do it if you want to.
Totally.
It's not immediate what the employment opportunities in a place like this would be. But that's pretty impressive. I was impressed with you when I first met you. Continue to, and still am.
Oh, that's very sweet. Thank you. Well, and it's also a testament to having a feeling and following it, not knowing what the outcome is going to be. And I felt very much that way when I was moving here. Like I was being pulled here, and I could not explain why or what to expect.
But you couldn't deny it.
I couldn't deny it, no.
The times in your life that those things happen, it's pretty amazing.
Right, yeah. Listen to your intuition. It's there for a reason.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we're very lucky to have happened to you.
Oh. I feel lucky to be here.
When you arrived, how did you create community? Did you seek it out or did it evolve slowly, organically?
When I first came, one of the first places that I learned through Stephanie and Jay's website about was the Copper Mountain Mesa Community Center up on the Mesa in North Joshua Tree. At the time, they had a first Saturday of the month pancake breakfast, and they also have an end of the month potluck. So on one of I think it was when I was here house sitting, it happened to be the end of July, and I knew that the potluck was going to happen. So I thought, I'll just drive up there. Well, what I didn't realize, one, was that I'd be doing the last 2.5 miles to the center on dirt road. Because obviously, staying near downtown Joshua Tree, the house I was house sitting was off dirt road. But I didn't plan for the dirt road to the community center, so I was a little late. And it was like that quintessential scene when the stranger walks into the bar and the jukebox goes... and everything stops and everybody looks at the door. It was exactly that. But everybody was super welcoming and had a lot of advice to share and things like that. So then I started volunteering up there for the breakfast. When I moved here, I would go up and serve breakfast. And then eventually I was working in the kitchen, helping with coffee. And then my last official volunteer duty up there was being the person who actually took the money as you walked in the door and greeted you. At the breakfast.
Oh, wow.
So, and once I opened my own business, there wasn't a lot of time for that. So I had to beg off. It was a Saturday morning thing, and I needed to be open on Saturday morning. So I had to.
So you did that up until you opened Soul Connection?
Pretty much, yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wow, that's a good stint.
Yeah. Yeah, it was a long time. But, you get to really meet people that way. And I think another thing that's so helpful that people may discount is reading the local paper. It only comes out once a week, and now the weekend edition is online. I don't know if they'll go back to a printed version or not, but the High Desert Star was a huge source of information for me when I would come up on my visits. Again, you can really see what's important to a community, what's happening in a community, and the local radio station. I mean, it's hyper local here, so you're hearing everything that's going on in the communities right around you. It's not like you're living in Jersey and you're surviving on New York news. That's, not as relevant. But those are some things that if people are coming here, can and should do, even before moving here, to discover a little bit more about where they're moving and who's around them.
Is that what prompted you to do your article in the High Desert Star now?
No, actually, it's funny you should mention that because Teresa Seitz was originally the JT Do Tell person when I moved here. I don't remember who was before her. And what's weird is one of the first times I went up to the Copper Mountain Mesa Community Center for pancake breakfast, Teresa was at the door greeting and taking the money. And I walked in one day and I was like, oh, you are the person who writes the JT Do Tell column. She goes, yep, that's me. And it's just ironic that then I would be the person sitting at the desk. And when she was ready to move on to some other things, she reached out to me and said, hey, would you be interested in writing this column? And introduced me to Stacy and Leslie at the High Desert Star. And then I've been doing that probably for, Over a year now. It's
Yeah.
over a year, maybe even close to 2 soon.
Wonderful.
Yeah, but I like knowing what's happening around town and sharing that with people who either live here or don't. It's a good fit.
Yeah, that's great. So is that same community enthusiasm what caused you to start the podcast?
I would say so. I mean, there were a couple of things. One was I was looking for ways to promote my voiceover business. So I was trying to come up with avenues that would do that for me. And the other thing was that not only up at the Pancake Breakfast, but other places where I was getting involved in the community, I realized that I was meeting some amazing women that had also moved here, although some of them also were born and raised here, but they were just doing some really interesting things and they were really interesting people. And I don't know, like most good ideas, I think it came to me in the shower and I thought, oh, I could just interview these women. And that's how it got started. And truth be told, I reached out like probably the first, I don't know, 8 or dozen episodes were people who were friends. And I thought, let me start this way and see if it seems viable. And then we'll go on and see who else, in the community I can interview. So I really appreciate those first 8 to a dozen ladies who said, sure, I'll come to your kitchen table and talk to you about why I came to the desert or what it's been like to live in the desert or grow up in the desert and things like that. And then it just caught on from there. And I think one of the best things about it was hearing from people who would say, I know her, but I didn't know that about her. Things that may have come up during the podcast that were either in people's past lives or things that even they might be working on now that people weren't aware of. Because pre-COVID, we had a lot of social interaction here between the music scene and the art scene, and you'd see people there, but it's not like you would get into a deep conversation. And I think that's one of the things that I've appreciated most about doing the podcast is my honor to be able to sit down with somebody one-on-one for 30 or 45 minutes and really hear them and learn about them and who they are as a person and what they bring to the world.
Mm-hmm. So your initial plan of doing this podcast to be a promotion for your voiceover turned out to be a surprising preservation of history of the area?
Yes, and that was not something that I recognized immediately. It took someone else kind of saying that to me and saying, you realize what you're doing here is documenting a space in time in this place. And at first I was like, yeah, I guess. It didn't really hit me. And a few months later, our community lost Melanie Buck. And Melanie, actually, when I talked earlier about the going down to the library and using the Wi-Fi, Melanie was the second person I met when I moved here. Mm-hmm. Because I kept coming in like every day. And she finally said to me, do you live here? I think I'd gotten like a visitor's membership or something. And she said, do you live here? And I said, not yet, but I'm working on it. She says, oh, you totally should. This place is so great. And she really was an advocate for this desert, and she loved it so much. And I interviewed her in October, I want to say maybe it was 2017, because I started in 2017, and she was one of the earlier ones. And we lost her about a month and a half later. And it was at that moment that I realized, yes, you are capturing something important here. So it wasn't something that I started out to do, but also realizing that that's what then took me over to the 29 Palms Historical Society to say, hey, listen, so it seems like I'm documenting some things here, and I wonder if you would be interested in having it in your archives. So we did a full-blown agreement, and every month when the episode is done, I send them the guest's photo, the episode, the bio, and also a transcript of the podcast. So I don't know if anyone is interested in 20, 30, 50 years from now to know what was going on in the high desert during this time, particularly with women. They'll be able to find it there, which is pretty exciting.
That is.
Yeah.
That is quite a gift. Tell me the story of you becoming the very successful owner of Soul Connection.
Well, when I lived in Cleveland, I've lived in many places. I started in Jersey. That's where I was born and raised. And I left Jersey in 96 and went to Charlotte for a bank job. Went to Cleveland for a man. I don't recommend either. If you're from Cleveland, I'm sorry. It wasn't for me. Then to Orlando, Florida, and then to Los Angeles, and then to the desert. And when I was in Cleveland, I went through a period at the bank where I knew it was time to leave. I was having some struggles with depression, and a doctor said, you need to get out of there. You are totally stressed out at this job. There's so much you're trying to control that you can't, and you just need to get out. And I'm going to slap a prescription on you too, which I wasn't really happy about, but I did it. And during that time, I rediscovered crafting, and I was making hand-painted t-shirts, and I was making handmade cards and things like that. And I thought, I wonder if I could sell these. So I started going to craft shows in the area and started selling there. And then I noticed in the paper, because I read the paper, I'm like an old guy. I like to sit down and read the newspaper. I think I can thank my father for that, because he was a big newspaper reader every day. I was reading the newspaper, and in the classifieds, there was a guy who was offering a sublet, and it was like really inexpensive. And it was in a funky part of a Cleveland suburb called Lakewood. And I thought, holy crow, I could literally open a storefront. So I went to see him. He was the proprietor he had a fitness business and a tanning salon. So I had a constant stream of customers walking through my little, street front storefront. And I think it was even probably smaller than what I'm in now, believe it or not. So they only had one consignor there, but most of the stuff was either my own work that I had done, and there was a local place that I was able to go to and buy wholesale with a shopping cart, not just online.
Yeah.
And I would bring in, I had candles, and I had shirts, and I had the cards, and all kinds of knick-knack sort of stuff. And one day I showed up to open the store, and the building was padlocked. And I was like, oh my God, what happened? So I went next door. The landlord happened to have an office right next door, and I was like, I'm trying to get in. What's happening? And Jeff, who owned the tanning salon, was apparently trying to sell the business. And apparently the deal went bad, and he was no longer insured in the building. So the landlord said, nothing's insured, and you all need to get out. Now, you all was me, who had the storefront space, and then there was the basement downstairs that had about 3 different areas. One woman was a seamstress. I don't know how long she had been there, but it was a long time. And she had
just like overnight?
Yes.
Oh, wow.
She had a bunch, like fabrics and clothing she had made and all kinds of stuff, alterations she was in the middle of doing. The other guy had a massage business, so he had his little space to pack up. I said, can I do a slasher sale over the next couple of weekends? He's like, no, you need to get everything out. And then the guy was lost his job, which is how we ended up back in Florida, because he still had a home there. And I had never again thought about opening another retail store until I saw the sheds go up over at your property. And I was like, ooh, this is manageable. And I started to think, oh, I could do this again. So then I put my name on the list. It came up really fast. But here I am today now, celebrating 2 years this month, November, even through COVID. And thank you for your generosity through that. So it's really exciting to be celebrating 2 years in business, and it's going really well. I'm just so happy. When I was a kid, I used to play shopkeeper in my room, and when my brother would have sporting events, I would be raising my hand to work the concession stand, just kind of doing that merchant thing, setting up yard sales on our front porch. And I'm not like the guy who just puts the stuff out and says, do whatever. I'm the guy who is like planning where everything is going to go and pricing everything accordingly and just doing all that. And I'm like, I was meant to be a merchant. And being that merchant is requiring a lot more of my time than I anticipated. I mean, especially when you're doing it pretty much by yourself, doing the accounting and the bookkeeping and the marketing and the website and the planning and working the hours and doing the buying. There's a lot involved. And sometimes in life, you just have to take a step back and look at everything that's taking up your time. And one of the reasons that I'm being interviewed today is not only because Pat Remington said people are going to want to know who this lady was who wanted to do this podcast, but it's also because time.
Yeah.
Each episode is only 30 minutes long, but in the background it takes 4 to 6 hours to do. And that's 12 hours a month that I feel like I need to put into my business.
Oh, sure.
You know,
Sure. That's a lot of time.
It's a lot of time. It's like a little part-time job, except I'm not getting paid for it. Not that I don't appreciate all the donations and the Patreon supporters. They're wonderful, and I couldn't do it without that because just the infrastructure of the podcast itself has a financial component to it. That there's a requirement that certain things be paid for, and anyone who has contributed or is contributed monthly, that is where your donations are going to support the infrastructure required to keep this on the air. So essentially, this is the last episode of the podcast, and what I'll be doing over the next, till the end of the year, is just working on moving things around so that the episodes still can be found, but that financial component becomes reduced to hopefully near nothing, just so the podcast can live essentially probably on YouTube, which is what I guess one of the only free ones out there now. So you will be able to find all the episodes there, but there will be no more new episodes. But this is episode 165, and it's been going since, I think, the summer of 2017. It was the year after I moved here, the summer after I moved here, that I started doing it. So thank you for listening one last time. If you have any questions or comments, you know where to find me, desertladydiaries@gmail.com. Feel free to send an email. I think we are going to do one last Diary Unlocked episode, so I'm going to pick some questions like I normally have our guests do at the end, and those will be up for the Patreon subscribers. And to the Patreon subscribers, thank you very much for your support through all of this, and I will be in touch with you all separately to talk about how that winds down going forward in January of 2022.
Wow. Well, I'm sure I'm speaking for all of the community. Thank you
You're welcome.
very much.
I appreciate it.
What a beautiful contribution to this. You're awesome.
Oh, thank you. It's become a big part of me and in this desert. So while I know it's just necessary for me to step away, it's just necessary, and to allow my business to grow into whatever that's going to look like in the coming years.
Oh, yeah.
So,
Well, you
thank
certainly deserve that.
Oh, well, thank you. And thank you for stepping in as guest host. You did a great job.
Oh, yeah. Tears and all.
Yay. All right, let me pick my numbers, and then you read the questions.
If you bought a lottery ticket that ends up winning $10 million, what would you do?
Oh, my gosh.
How do you define success? Any tattoos? Why or why not? What and why did you get it? If you have multiple, what's a favorite? Do you have a personal motto or mantra? What is it?
Okay, my answers to these questions will be available to current Patreon subscribers. Thanks again for listening.